This video is critical. If you are African American, please watch the video in its entirety and share it with as many African Americans as you can. The end of the video will offer an essential strategy for reparations by 2025. If you are an African American civil rights lawyer, your help may be greatly needed to help African Americans achieve this goal.
As the 2024 presidential elections loom, a crucial question must be answered. Should African Americans boycott the 2024 presidential elections? To answer this question, we must delve into the often complex and painful history of the African American political experience in America, a history replete with broken promises and systemic exploitation. The journey begins in the aftermath of the Civil War, where African Americans, having fought on the front lines for freedom, found themselves facing broken promises and economic betrayal. After more than 250 years as slaves, working day and night for free under the harshest circumstances in human history, African Americans emerged from the war with no land, no property, and no wealth. The U.S. government, foreseeing the potential catastrophe of millions of recently freed slaves lacking land, property, and a means to earn an income, devised a concept known today as 40 acres and a mule. Under this plan, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman proposed that the federal government allocate confiscated Confederate land to newly emancipated African Americans. The intention was to provide them with land for housing, upon which they could farm to earn an income, a pathway to accumulate wealth. Unfortunately, this promise was short-lived as it faced rejection from the white supremacists of the time. President Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Abraham Lincoln, overturned the plan, returning the land to its former Confederate owners. The rescission of the 40 acres and a mule promise had a profound impact on the economic trajectory of African Americans. While white Americans accumulated wealth through land ownership and free slave labor for centuries, African Americans were systematically forced into abject poverty with limited means of income for at least another century. This stark contrast in economic opportunities laid the foundation for enduring disparities that still exist today, with white communities amassing generational wealth while African Americans continued to face systemic poverty. The 40 acres and a mule broken promise set a precedent for a recurring pattern of exploitation that would last into the modern day. The Great Compromise of 1877, the next major political exploitation targeting African Americans, marked the end of the Reconstruction period in American history. The Great Compromise of 1877 further deepened the systemic marginalization of African Americans. With the passing of the ratified 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of the U.S. Constitution granting African Americans freedom from enslavement, while awarding citizenship and voting rights, many African Americans began to take an active role in the political process. Thousands of African Americans held local, state, and national political offices. Many African Americans held seats in the U.S. Congress and the U.S. Senate. However, rapid African American progress was met with intense white resistance. For Southern whites, Reconstruction was often perceived as a humiliating imposition. The South's economy, heavily reliant on slave labor, was decimated. Additionally, many resented the political upheaval and the dramatic shift in the social hierarchy. This resentment gave birth to violent organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, aimed at suppressing African Americans and their newfound rights. Post-Civil War America was a divided nation. Reconstruction was an ambitious project aimed at rebuilding the war-torn South. Ensuring civil rights for freed slaves faced immense opposition in the North, but especially in the South. The presidential election of 1876 between Republican Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican candidate from the party at the time that covertly exploited African Americans for votes by pretending to care about their needs, and Democrat Samuel J. Tilden, the overt racist party of the time, was fraught with disputes. Tilden won the popular vote but fell short in the Electoral College due to contested results in Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Oregon. With either side willing to concede, tensions mounted, threatening the very fabric of the nation. Out of this impasse came the Great Compromise of 1877. In exchange for the Democrats' acceptance of Hayes as president, the Republicans promised the withdrawal of federal troops from the South. This decision led to the end of Reconstruction, and not only the end of African American progression, but the end of African Americans' rights. Hayes also promised infrastructure development in the South and the appointment of a Southern Democrat to Hayes's cabinet. Acquiescence to the opposing overt white supremacist party, or to their sympathizers by giving them seats in the supposedly African American sympathetic party's cabinet, or as vice president on the presidential ticket, is another important ploy from the African American exploitation playbook. African Americans must keep this in mind. This political ploy will be enacted again in another exploitation we will cover in just a moment. For African Americans, the compromise was a betrayal. With federal troops gone, the South witnessed the rapid rise of white supremacist groups such as the KKK and new oppressive laws targeting African Americans such as Black Codes and eventually Jim Crow laws. These laws marginalized and disenfranchised African Americans by creating an American apartheid system for an additional century. This apartheid system, known as segregation, did not end until 1965. The very rights African Americans had so recently secured during Reconstruction between 1865 and 1877 were systematically stripped away. Sound familiar? The rise of normalized white supremacy in our modern time began after the election of Barack Obama. Today, overt racism is once again becoming the norm because of African American political gains. Once again, African American rights are being eroded. The Great Compromise of 1877 is an important time in U.S. history. One that every African American should know about and understand because the same playbook is being used today with a modern twist. If you are enjoying this video, please subscribe to this channel, share the video, and leave a comment. Let's continue. Faced with the harsh discrimination of Jim Crow laws, many African Americans began to recognize that no party truly had their interest at heart until the 1930s. When a charismatic politician named Franklin Delano Roosevelt entered the political arena. Roosevelt, a Democrat, courted the black vote by making promises to African Americans wrapped in what he called the New Deal. African Americans, hopeful that the needs of their people would finally be met, began to vote en masse for Democrats. The New Deal was a series of programs, policies, and reforms initiated by President Franklin D. Roosevelt in the 1930s. To address the economic challenges of the Great Depression. Enacted between 1933 and 1938, the New Deal aimed to provide relief, recovery, and reform to the American economy and society. The New Deal, while providing relief to a few African Americans, did little to dismantle systemic racism. Many New Deal programs were administered at the local level, allowing for racial discrimination in their implementation. African Americans were exploited once again for their votes, largely without reaping any benefits. Despite their overwhelming support, the Democratic Party failed to address systemic racism within its policies, further deepening the exploitation of the African American community. Sick of the political exploitation, systemic racism, and an oppressive apartheid system, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s launched. African Americans took to the streets in protest. Many were beaten and murdered, while many more faced intimidation. African Americans fought for their rights, demanding an end to segregation, discrimination, and the denial of voting rights. They faced fierce opposition from a significant portion of white America, both men and women, unlike modern narratives often portrayed today. The culmination of the civil rights movement was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. A landmark piece of legislation that aimed to end racial segregation and discrimination faced by African Americans. Yet, the victory was bittersweet, as the fight for true equality was far from over. In the wake of the Civil Rights Act, the concept of affirmative action emerged. A policy aimed at addressing historical and systemic inequalities faced by African Americans. Affirmative action is a set of policies and practices that were supposed to be aimed at promoting equal opportunities for African Americans in various sectors of society, in education, employment, housing, government contracts, and social services. Affirmative action, as it was intended, was to rectify past and present injustices for African Americans. However, the focus of affirmative action took a turn away from African Americans with the ascent of Lyndon B. Johnson to the presidency after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Lyndon B. Johnson, a known segregationist, exploited affirmative action for political gains. His presidency saw the dilution of the intended beneficiaries of this policy, as it was manipulated to include white women who were at the time largely resistant to African American civil rights and other minority groups who did not face the same level of systemic oppression, many of whom were recent immigrants. Let's pull out the white supremacist handbook of political exploitation of African Americans again. Remember, It was pointed out that during the Reconstruction era's Great Compromise of 1877, in exchange for the overtly racist party of the time, the Democrats, to accept the then presidential Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes as president. Hayes, in his unprincipled quest to become president, made a deal that would stab African Americans in the back and throw them into the American apartheid system known as segregation by agreeing to give a Southern Democrat a seat in Hayes' administration. To understand how affirmative action shifted from helping African Americans, who fought the civil rights struggle, died en masse for civil rights, and experienced slavery while at the same time during this period were victims of apartheid, to including white women, who were against African American civil rights and the majority of whom were perpetrators of white supremacy during this period, and adding other non-white minorities, let's watch the handbook in action in 1960. In 1960, then-Senator John Fitzgerald Kennedy's presidential ambition necessitated a delicate balancing act between the Northern progressives and Southern Democrat segregationists. This balancing act led Kennedy to strategically select a Southern segregationist Democrat from Texas, Senator Lyndon Baines Johnson, as his running mate. This Democratic alliance was pivotal in securing Kennedy the presidency, despite Kennedy and Johnson's underlying tensions related to Kennedy's liberal stance for civil rights, his Catholic faith, and Johnson's segregationist views. Kennedy's choice of Johnson, a known segregationist with a history of diluting civil rights measures, was a calculated move aimed at uniting divergent Democratic factions, which led to John F. Kennedy becoming president and Lyndon B. Johnson becoming his vice president. Did you catch the play? Another political move from the handbook. Johnson's political acumen soon became apparent following Kennedy's 1963 assassination. Now that Johnson was president, he faced a political conundrum. With the civil rights movement intensifying and his own 1964 presidential election looming, Johnson needed to appease his Southern segregationist base and play nice with the increasingly influential African American electorate. Who do you think he ends up appeasing? Stay tuned, there's more. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson signed into law the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This playbook move was Houdini-ish. This magical act has led to nearly 60 more years of African American oppression under the guise of affirmative action progress. In 1965, Johnson, the same politician who had historically watered down civil rights policies, later that year, his administration expanded John F. Kennedy's affirmative action program in a way that fundamentally altered its trajectory. He added white women and other minorities as beneficiaries. Nearly 60 years later, with hordes of studies and statistics to prove, the consequences of this manipulation cannot be denied. White women, and thereby white people and other minority groups, are the primary beneficiaries of affirmative action, with white women benefiting the most. African Americans continue to substantially fare worse in all areas of affirmative action. The very people who died for it, and who it was meant for, barely benefit at all. The exploitation of the African American vote didn't end with historical injustices. Democrats have continued to leverage promises without delivering substantive change, to include police brutality and the prison and military-industrial complex, which target blacks almost exclusively. Black communities throughout the U.S. still endure apartheid treatment, with most of them in abject poverty. Another modern exploitation is the glaring call for reparations, a demand that African Americans have voiced since 2008. In 2020, in exchange for the African American vote, Joe Biden promised a commission on reparations. However, African Americans have yet to hear anything substantial from the administration regarding this crucial issue. This unfulfilled promise highlights a continued pattern of exploitation and indifference. The call for reparations has become more urgent than ever. African Americans have endured centuries of broken promises, systemic exploitation, and unfulfilled pledges. The time for reparations is now. The Democratic Party, historically seen as an ally, must make a concrete pledge in writing. If the 2024 Democratic candidate does not commit to creating an executive order for reparations by his or her first week in office in January 2025, African Americans must be prepared to take a decisive step. The power to effect change lies in the hands of the people. If the Democratic candidate fails to make this pledge in writing, African Americans must boycott the 2024 presidential elections and be prepared for additional boycotts. It's a difficult decision, many acknowledge. The presidential victory will undoubtedly fall into the hands of the overt racists of the Republican Party. Yet this is a moment where African Americans must recognize that African Americans have nothing to lose. White supremacy is on the rise whether African Americans vote or choose to refrain. What will be, will be. African American ancestors stepped up to the plate. It is time for this generation to act. America has been playing a good cop versus bad cop game against African Americans for more than a century. The modern-day covert Democrats against the overt Republicans. African Americans must realize that whether overt or covert, systemic racism has always left African Americans on the losing end. If African Americans do nothing, they will be complicit in their own oppression. Reparations are not negotiable. The demand is not a mere request but a necessity for rectifying centuries of injustice. It's a call for economic empowerment, the restoration of stolen wealth, and a chance for African Americans to break free from the shackles of systemic exploitation. Should African Americans boycott the 2024 presidential elections? The ball is in the court of the Democratic Party. The answer lies in the willingness of the Democratic candidate to agree to an executive order for reparations by January 2025. Without this, African Americans may have no choice but to withhold their vote, sending a powerful message that the time for empty promises has come to an end. If you are interested in joining this movement, contact us using our email address in the About Us section. Leave your contact information, your name, phone number, and email address. If you enjoyed this video and enjoy learning about African and African American geopolitics, please subscribe, like, leave a comment, and share this video with as many people as you can. Thanks for watching.